Hi everyone, I hope you're well. So today I'm going to talk about a specific book, a novel which was kind of controversial some years ago. The year that it came out. I think it came out in 2020 or so. What happens with this book is that, which is American Dirt, as the title says, of course, is that the first time, the time I read it and the first time I reviewed it, and I wrote my script for this video. For one, I had some audio problems, which hopefully I don't have this time around. And also, there was this thing where the more I thought about it, the more I feel like maybe I was way too generous with my review. There were some things that maybe I wasn't considering. And, I read other reviews by other Mexicans and other Latin Americans of this novel, and I realized that there were more issues with it, even more than I had initially discovered the first time that I reviewed it, or rather the time that I read it. It's always awkward to read something that a foreigner writes about people of your own nationality, but something that is overall really obvious from the novel overall is that it's very clear that it's written for Americans for a number of different reasons that have been talked about by other people's reviews, and that I will also go on here. Obligatory, recognition that I'm white, even though I'm also Mexican, but of course, Mexicans are going to have all kinds of different opinions about this book, and some of us are going to like it more than others, and some of us are going to hate it more than others, and that's all fine. I mean, we don't have to, for one, we don't have the same experiences, and therefore we are certainly not going to all have the same opinion. So the video itself is going to be made up of a couple different sections. The first one is going to be me talking about inaccuracies and things that I found that kind of annoyed me, or that I found kind of awkward as a Mexican throughout reading this book. And the second part is going to be the proper review that I do of this book, the same way that I do with any other book, which is the same as usual, characters, plot, storyline, depth, writing style, etc. So I want to address some of the criticism first that I have seen towards the book, that I don't necessarily, actually I do somewhat agree with, but I have kind of complicated feelings about. So one of the main criticisms that I've seen both on Goodreads and here on YouTube is that this novel is kind of something that gets referred to as trauma porn, or tragedy porn, which is something that I have read before on other books, and that I have criticized before. This book is definitely something that makes up this really tragic view of what happens when crossing the border, but it's not necessarily any more realistic than a less dramatized version would be. I feel like this book truly is a little bit more, has more shock than it has depth. I will link another review down below where she talks about these same points that I'm about to bring up, but a lot of really traumatic things happen to some of the characters, and they just kind of happen, and they're not really developed in the story, not really talked about afterwards, they don't really manifest into all these different consequences. Really, with how long the book is, it definitely could have made a lot of space for that kind of discussion and that kind of narration and kind of introspection, I guess. The narration is third person, so it wasn't really a limitation in terms of that. A lot of the bulk of the book is taken up by things that really don't matter in comparison to those shock factors. Another criticism that I found about it is that it strongly plays on stereotypes, which again I kind of agree and disagree in a way. I feel like as a general rule, I do feel like it's valid to take some stereotypical aspects of a group of people that you're representing if they actually do realistically happen. Like, for example, quinceañeras are something that is actually quite common. It's quite just traditional overall. 15th birthday, you make a big party and everything. Not everyone does it, obviously. But, if you go out at night on any given Saturday night, you're going to find a lot of, at least one girl on her 15th birthday who has, she's driving through her limousine, accompanied by all these people on the street, and it's a whole thing. I do guess that a lot of the issues is that the way that it is kind of juxtaposed with other things that are also very stereotypical, like for example narcos, of course, drug lords, and these things that kind of really play on the images that Americans already have about Mexicans. One argument that I have to say I do definitely disagree with is the idea that she doesn't have the right to write this story because it isn't hers. For one, because technically it isn't hers and it's not anyone's story at all, because it's fictional even though it's based on a real process. And I really think that overall, as a general rule, authors should be allowed to write whatever they want to write about. And we are also free to criticize the way they write it, but not necessarily not the fact that they write that in the first place, I think. I kind of went about this on a kind of old video, I guess. I'm kind of promoting here, but I had a video about what I think are racist tropes in Native American / white woman romances or westerns, and some people kind of I guess took it the wrong way, or they assumed or they interpreted that I was against any sort of depiction of this pairing in general, which of course I'm not. I mean, if I were, I wouldn't be reading those books in the first place. And also presenting this whole thing of like, these people are allowed to do this and these people are not, kind of presents a whole kind of worms in itself of who is then Mexican enough to write a story about Mexicans. Like, is someone who's like a third generation Mexican enough? Like, are they not allowed to then? Or someone who's Latin American but not Mexican specifically? I mean, what's gonna happen with those things, And in terms of the inaccuracies or awkward, weird things that I noticed throughout the book, one of them is of course the owl thing. And there were some other things that again are mentioned in the review that I will link down below. For example, the use of basements and of carpeting, which are not at all common in Latin America. Well, in Mexico, not anyway. It's pretty much all tile, and basements are pretty uncommon. The kinds of things that really only take like a 2-second Google search for the author to make that kind of research. It's like she didn't really consider it at all, or maybe someone told her and she decided to disregard it, who knows. If you're gonna give a character a nickname which is after an animal, you might as well like Google, like owls in Mexican folklore. And I googled it recently, and there's a lot of results about it that talk about the association between owls and witches and witchcraft in Mexican folklore. So I don't really see how a couple of years ago there wouldn't have been any information about it. There certainly was. I feel like it would have been really obvious to simply do those 2 seconds of Google search. And of course, these things are small issues, of course, that again don't have anything to do with my overall review of the book itself. And I feel like things that, like inaccuracies, are kind of the smaller problems in a book anyway. I feel like they don't really make that much of a difference in terms of how good of a story you tell. But they are things that I feel like would be valuable for me to say because I am Mexican, of course. And of course, I have to also mention that, I'm not the spokesperson for the Mexicans. I'm not the end-all be-all. There's also a few moments that felt a little bit cringe. I know that that word is extremely overused, and I don't like how it's been overused, but there's no better way to describe the way that I reacted when I read this. There's a part where the narrator is speaking kind of through the perspective of the child, one of the characters, and who is a Mexican, of course. And he refers to one of the other characters, a woman, as looking or having the face of an Aztec warrior, which is a bit odd because she is from Honduras, she's from Central America, and this character knows it. And he's actually one of his main quirk is that he knows a lot about geography. So he knows the difference, certainly, even though he's only 8. A lot of children just have really specific interests like that, The fact that he refers to her as an Aztec warrior is kind of such an awkward thing because she's from Central America. I mean, you could have easily said like Mayan warrior or something like that. I mean, it would have been a bit corny, I guess, but it wouldn't have been geographically, historically inaccurate. Those little things that remind me that the person writing the book is clearly not Mexican, and they could have really done more research about it. I mean, I don't think it's a question of skill as much as one of effort. Another thing that seemed really odd to me is that the characters kept referring to the US as the North. Pretty much all of the characters, when referring to the US, they used that, they often use the North to refer to it. But in my experience, pretty much whenever a Mexican says the North, they mean the north of Mexico, not the US, not north of the border. Because why? How would you refer to north of Mexico if you refer to the US as the North? And it's not all one unified country. There's a lot of different things going on inside the country. And something else regarding the whole northern thing that bothered me is that at some point, for example, she refers to the phrase "que onda way" as being a northern slang type phrase, but it's not. That's like an all over Mexico thing. Like, everyone says it, everyone knows what it means. Nobody would ever be confused as to what that means. And the character, who is also Mexican, when a northern character says it to him, he's like completely bewildered. Like, he has no idea what that could possibly mean. And there's also another point where this same kid, who is a northerner, refuses to bring a jacket with him to cross the border to the US. But it's so strange. For one, because the conflict was completely forced there and it was pretty much resolved immediately, so it wasn't necessary anyway. But also because pretty much anyone from the north knows that in the desert it's really cold at night. It doesn't matter how hot it is during the day, it's probably gonna be very cold at night, with a few exceptions throughout the year, but as a general rule, it's cold at night. And you need a sweater if you're going out at night or at dawn. And I kind of resent the way that she uses this character to insinuate that northern Mexicans are like completely ignorant about anything about the rest of the country. Like, they have no idea what the rest of the country is like. They cannot recognize any city, any names of any cities outside of the north. And they wouldn't be able to recognize anything. They don't recognize slang from Mexico City or anything, and that the only way they speak is by using kind of a mixture of English and Spanish all the time. A lot of northerners don't, even in border cities, don't speak English at all, so that's kind of not the case at all. And also, what makes it especially weird is that the characters themselves, because a lot of the narration and the dialogue is constantly adding Spanish words where there doesn't need to be, the translation doesn't need to happen. It makes it seem odd because this character points out how this kid is randomly throwing in English words, but the character himself, within the story, he's supposed to be speaking Spanish, of course, but the way he speaks is like English with some Spanish words thrown in, so there's really not that much difference between one thing and the other. Something else that really did bother me is this weird insinuation that only women who are like especially attractive are like at risk of being raped during this journey to cross the US. To the US. I mean, Lydia herself was still quite a young woman. I think she was supposed to be like in her early 30s or something like that. And she never had to face this threat for some reason, even though the teen girls, who by the way were like constantly mentioned as being like extremely attractive, like that was basically their main character trait that the author gave you about them. They were the only ones who were constantly under this threat, when that's just not the case at all. I mean, pretty much all women who are going to cross under these specific circumstances are going to either face this threat or are going to have this happen to them. You don't have to be specifically especially attractive for this to be a threat to you. You don't even have to be a woman in the first place. So I just really, it's just such a one note, such a surface level take on these kinds of phenomena, whatever. So the next part, of course, is going to be my usual review that I always do, and I'm going to start with writing style. So for this, I do give half a star. I have some issues with it. I had things I did think were good, well made. The book, I think, as a whole, in technical terms, is fairly well written. Um, the style itself, at least, is quite descriptive. It's able to give you a pretty vivid and clear picture of what's going on. Sometimes it goes on pretty vividly about the experiences and the feelings of the characters. In fact, I feel like the strongest point of this book is the fact that it's the way that it explores grief throughout the whole narration. But it often does also tell more than it shows in terms of emotions as well. And another thing that I don't like is that it just chooses random words to translate into Spanish. And that makes sense sometimes when you think the translation is necessarily better and it's worth to kind of interrupt the flow of the reading to have this more accurate translation, to have this word that doesn't really have an equal in terms of the connotations and the things that it implies. But that wasn't the case really with not a lot of words. If basically, I would say not any of the translations were really justified. And in fact, I feel like the contrast in the words kind of gives you this idea as if they were speaking English, but just throwing random Spanish words in there, like I mentioned, when it really they're supposed to be speaking Spanish the whole time anyway. Another thing that I really disliked about the writing style is that it constantly just really over-explained things sometimes. For example, things that are just obvious or things that you could have expected parallels in the story that you didn't need to have explained to you, or these comparisons between the beginning of the story and the middle, that again, you read the story, you were there, you don't need to be told like, oh, a few weeks ago this would have happened, but now I'm in this situation, like I know I'm reading the story, I don't need to this to be said again. And also sometimes it just goes at length explaining why Lydia the character does certain things that are like very motherly and protective and this and that and the other, when it's really not necessary, because I know she's a mother, I know why she's doing these things, they don't need to be explained. In terms of storyline and plot, I give it half a star as well. um, I appreciate that it starts off with a kind of intense scene, but it also does something that's kind of a pet peeve of mine, which is introducing a bunch of characters all at once from the very beginning. And granted, they're pretty much all dead from the beginning, but that's kind of worse in a way. Like, they're all dead, and now you're supposed to meet them all at the same time. But in terms of the storyline as well, everything is very drawn out. Like, the pacing is just so slow, and it's also very repetitive. And all of these little conflicts happen that get resolved immediately, and they don't make any difference in terms of the progress of the story, and one thing leading to another. They're just kind of things that happen one after the other, but they don't really help to show you character or develop characters or advance the plot or anything. They're just kind of things that are there. And overall, the story is also repetitive itself. Like, this has, again, I'm sure it's also mentioned in the review that I mentioned, but the way they keep boarding the train and then leaving, stay in a certain place for like a day or two, and then they have to go jump into onto the train again. And this is something that happens like a whole 5 times or something like that, and it feels like it goes on forever. In terms of characters, I give it half a star. I actually like Luca. I think maybe he's not the most popular character, but I think he's a fairly realistic character, and I feel like he's giving a fair bit, a justified and realistic amount, I guess, of self-reflection and of depth for his age. And he's probably the most fleshed out character out of them, out of the main ones anyway. Most of the characters, Lydia is basically just, most of them are archetypes more than anything else. Lydia is just a mother who is just a mother. She's just kind of what she is, basically. The big sister who is very protective of her younger sister, and both of them are like perpetual victims. The little sister who is like a bit more innocent and soft, and this villain who has like this soft spot and this kind of almost like this sense of like honor, like in the mafia movies, where, because he's a drug lord, of course, like in the mafia movies where they're like, oh, but we have this code of honor. Because let's be honest, okay, these people who are in this who are in this life, they kill, they don't care if innocent people get in the line of fire. Okay, they don't care if a fucking baby gets in the line of fire. And I feel like this story was kind of romanticizing the drug lord a little bit by making him out to be this like intellectual poet and this and that and the other. Almost like romanticizing him almost in a literal sense of like making him portraying him as being kind of this attractive man. And of course, being archetypal isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can be based on an archetype and still have some depth to yourself as a character. But these characters are pretty much only archetypes and nothing else. In terms of depth, I have to give it half a star again. It seems to have a very good grasp on grief, like I mentioned, and what it's like. Um, but at the same time, I feel like in terms of any other subject, there wasn't really that much to say. In terms of this whole migration, this journey, there wasn't really that much. There was basically nothing in this book that I didn't already know, and not the things that I knew from research or any sort of in-depth, studying or anything, but rather things that I just kind of knew from general knowledge, things that pretty much all Mexicans know. And so the way that it was written, it kind of seemed to me as either she didn't do that much research, or all the research that she did just happened to align perfectly with my idea of what these kinds of journeys were like. I also feel like the book is somewhat morally clean and almost a little bit Hollywood-esque, in the sense that it's afraid to take risks. It's afraid to kill off any characters that have been there for too long, that you might feel a little too attached to. And I feel like pretty much all of the characters that die are ones that like did something really evil just before dying or at some point before dying. Excluding the ones who died at the very beginning, of course. But the characters who died throughout the story. And again, there were things in the story that could have theme subjects in the story that could have been explored. Miscarriage and, for example, like I mentioned in the review that I link, the fact that one of the characters, the main characters, one of them shoots someone in the desert. They kill someone, and after that, they also do something slightly ridiculous in the plot. But the point is that they literally kill someone, and there's no real development. It's like, I just killed someone. And some points in the story were especially like Hollywood-esque. Like I said, the thing that happens after he dies and she makes this video call is a little insane to think of, honestly. And especially all of the other things that, after all those other things that have been discussed before about not using the phones and being so afraid and all these things, the boldness. But which kind of these things went completely unexplained and unjustified. And like I said, the miscarriage that just kind of happened and then never really got brought up again. In terms of enjoyment, I'm going to have to give it another half star. So pretty much it's just, I guess, 5 out of 10 or 2.5 out of 5. It's kind of a depressing read, and like I said, the fact that it's very repetitive and monotone doesn't really help much. The characters are also pretty one note, and nothing extremely unexpected really happens at any point in the story. However, I do have to admit that throughout the book, I did feel stressed out. I did feel this tension of this situation, and I did root for the main characters, for them to survive and for them to be well and for nothing bad to happen to them. So it's exactly like I said. I have mixed feelings about this book. If you hate it more than I did, then I absolutely understand it. And if you liked it more than I did, I also understand. And that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.